Put him in handcuffs before he tries to run another scam. The words sliced through the polished marble lobby of the Whitman Grand Hotel like a sudden crack of thunder, loud enough that every guest near the front desk turned to look. The chandelier above reflected warm gold light across the room, bouncing off polished floors, brass luggage carts, and the quiet confidence of travelers who believed they were standing inside one of the most respected luxury hotels in the United States. At least, that's what the brand promised. But at that exact moment, the atmosphere inside the lobby shifted from elegance to tension. Standing near the reception desk was a tall black man in his early 40s wearing a plain charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. Nothing flashy. No designer logos. No expensive watch glinting under the lights. Just calm eyes and a still posture that seemed almost out of place in the middle of the rising commotion. His name was Darius Coleman, though nobody in that lobby seemed to recognize it yet. Behind the counter stood Gregory Whitman, the hotel's general manager, a man who had spent 15 years climbing the ladder of luxury hospitality and who carried himself like the building itself belonged to him. Gregory's tailored suit fit perfectly, his silver name tag polished, his expression sharp with authority. He pointed toward Darius again, clearly enjoying the attention his accusation had drawn. Guests paused mid-conversation. A couple from Texas, standing near the concierge desk, stopped rolling their luggage. A business traveler holding a latte lowered his phone slightly, curiosity replacing the calm rhythm of his morning routine. Even the bellhop pushing a brass cart slowed down. Gregory folded his arms, his voice rising with confidence. "Sir, you've been asked to leave this property twice. You're refusing to comply and you don't appear to have a valid reservation." The statement hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. But Darius Coleman didn't react the way most people would. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, calm, his gaze steady on the manager in front of him. It was the kind of stillness that unsettled people more than shouting ever could. Behind the desk, a young receptionist named Emily Carter glanced nervously between them, clearly sensing something about the situation wasn't adding up. She had seen the man walk in just minutes earlier. He hadn't caused a scene. He hadn't demanded anything. He had simply approached the desk and asked a quiet question about room availability. But Gregory Whitman had already made up his mind before any details could matter. Across the lobby, a woman sitting in a leather chair slowly lifted her phone, pretending to check messages while her camera angled toward the front desk. The quiet murmur of the lobby faded into something sharper, more watchful. Gregory leaned forward slightly, his voice colder now. "We take security very seriously here, and I'm not going to let someone wander around this property pretending to be a guest." For a moment, the only sound in the lobby was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of dishes from the hotel restaurant. Then Darius finally spoke, his tone calm and measured, the kind of voice that carried without needing to be loud. "Interesting," he said slowly, looking around the room before meeting the manager's eyes again. "Because I came here today to see how this hotel treats its guests." Gregory let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Guests?" he replied, already reaching for the phone behind the desk. "Trust me, sir, you're not one of them." Gregory Whitman lifted the phone behind the front desk with the calm certainty of a man who believed the situation had already been decided. The polished brass receiver reflected the lobby lights as he pressed a button and waited for the line to connect. Around him, the quiet luxury of the Whitman Grand continued to hum softly. A rolling suitcase crossed the marble floor. The elevator chimed somewhere down the hall. But the tension at the front desk had begun to spread like a ripple through still water. Guests who had planned to walk straight to the elevator slowed down instead. A businessman in a navy suit leaned slightly against a column, watching. The couple from Texas exchanged a quick glance before stepping closer. Nobody spoke yet, but the room had started paying attention. Darius Coleman remained exactly where he had been standing, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He looked less like someone confronting a problem and more like someone quietly observing an experiment. That calm seemed to irritate Gregory Whitman even more. The manager covered the phone receiver briefly and looked up with a tight smile. That carried no warmth. "Security will be here in a moment," he said, loud enough for several people to hear. "They will escort you off the property." Darius did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted across the lobby, taking in every detail. The front desk arrangement. The marble flooring pattern that ran like a compass through the room. The framed photographs of historic hotels along the wall. All of it was familiar to him in a way nobody else in that room could understand. Behind the counter, Emily Carter shifted nervously. She glanced down at the reservation system on her computer screen, then back at the man standing in front of them. Something about the situation felt wrong. She had only been working at the Whitman Grand for 8 months, but she had learned enough to recognize when a guest acted entitled and when someone simply carried quiet confidence. This man was not arguing. He was not demanding anything. He was simply standing there, letting the room reveal itself. Gregory spoke again into the phone. "Yes, this is Gregory Whitman at the front desk. I have an individual refusing to leave the property after being asked multiple times. I would like assistance immediately." The words echoed slightly across the open lobby. A few heads turned more noticeably now. The woman sitting in the leather chair continued holding her phone at an angle that looked casual but was clearly recording. Darius watched the manager finish the call, then slowly tilted his head as if studying a detail others had missed. His voice when he spoke again was calm and even, the kind of tone that sounded almost thoughtful. "You made that decision very quickly," he said. Gregory set the receiver back into place with a firm click. "Experience teaches you how to spot a problem," he replied sharply. "And my responsibility is protecting this hotel." The statement hung in the air with the weight of authority. But Darius Coleman did not look offended. If anything, he seemed curious. He took a slow breath, then looked once more across the lobby as if measuring the room itself. 25 years earlier, he had stood in another hotel lobby almost exactly like this one. Different city, different building, same assumptions in the air. That night he had walked out without saying a word. That memory had stayed with him longer than anyone in that old building would ever know. It had followed him through business school, through his first real estate deal, through the moment he signed the paperwork that created Coleman Hospitality Group. And now he stood quietly inside one of the hotels that company owned. The irony would have been almost funny if the situation had not been so familiar. Emily finally spoke, her voice cautious. "Sir, if you do have a reservation, we can check the system again." Gregory raised a hand before she could continue. "That will not be necessary," he said firmly. Darius looked at the young employee, then back at the manager. His expression remained steady, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes now, something quieter and far more deliberate. The kind of change that only happened when patience had reached its limit. He slipped one hand into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out his phone, glancing briefly at the screen before speaking again in the same calm voice. "You are protecting the hotel," he said slowly. "That is interesting." Then he unlocked the phone and began scrolling through his contacts as if he had just decided something important. Darius Coleman held the phone loosely in his hand, his thumb moving slowly across the screen as if the growing tension around him did not exist. The quiet glow of the display reflected faintly in his eyes, while the lobby continued to shift from casual curiosity into focused attention. Gregory Whitman watched him with a mixture of impatience and irritation, the kind of expression a manager wears when he believes the situation should already be finished. To Gregory, the conclusion was obvious. A man who did not look like the typical guest of the Whitman Grand had walked in, asked questions, and refused to leave when challenged. In Gregory's mind the equation was simple, but the longer Darius stood there calmly scrolling through his phone, the more that certainty began to feel strangely fragile. Across the lobby the woman in the leather chair adjusted her posture slightly, so that her phone camera captured the front desk more clearly. The businessman near the column folded his arms, settling in as if he had just realized this moment was not going to end quickly. Even the bellhop had quietly stopped moving luggage carts and was now standing near the entrance pretending to straighten a stack of brochures while watching everything unfold. Emily Carter felt the tension more than anyone. Her eyes moved back and forth between Gregory and Darius as if she were trying to understand a puzzle that nobody else noticed. She glanced again at the reservation screen on her computer. The system was open, waiting for a name to be typed. But Gregory had already decided the search was unnecessary. That was what unsettled her the most. The manager stepped out from behind the desk now, his shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor as he closed the small distance between himself and the man he had already labeled a problem. His voice dropped into the firm tone of someone used to giving orders. "Sir, security is on the way," he said. I suggest you save yourself the embarrassment and leave before they arrive. The statement echoed across the lobby. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they were watching a misunderstanding or something far more deliberate. Darius finally lifted his eyes from the phone screen and looked directly at Gregory Whitman. The calm in his expression had not changed, but there was something sharper behind it now, like a decision that had quietly taken shape. Embarrassment, he repeated slowly, as if testing the word. Gregory folded his arms again, clearly confident in his authority. Yes, he replied, because situations like this tend to end the same way. Darius glanced briefly toward the entrance of the hotel, where the glass doors reflected the city street outside. Morning traffic moved steadily beyond the lobby, unaware that inside the building a small moment of tension was quietly building towards something larger. Then he returned his attention to the phone and selected a contact from the screen. The name displayed at the top was Angela Brooks. Gregory watched with open skepticism. Calling a friend is not going to change anything, he said flatly. But Darius raised the phone to his ear anyway. The line connected almost instantly. On the other end, a clear professional voice answered. Angela Brooks speaking. Darius spoke calmly, his tone steady and deliberate. Good morning, Angela. I need you to pull the operational file for the Whitman Grand location. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, the kind that happens when someone realizes a routine conversation may not be routine at all. Of course, Angela replied carefully. Is there a situation I should be aware of? Darius looked up at Gregory Whitman again, then slowly scanned the lobby around him, taking in the silent witnesses who had gathered around the scene. His voice remained calm, but the words carried a quiet weight that several people nearby could hear. Yes, he said evenly. You might say there is a situation developing at one of our hotels. Darius Coleman lowered the phone slightly from his ear, but did not end the call. Angela Brooks was still on the line, silent now, waiting. She had worked beside him for 8 years and understood the rhythm of his voice better than most people understood their own schedules. When he spoke that calmly, it meant something had already crossed the line. The lobby remained unusually quiet. Guests who had originally planned to move on with their morning had instead formed a loose half-circle several yards away from the front desk, pretending to check their phones or adjust their luggage while listening closely. Gregory Whitman noticed the attention but chose to ignore it. In his mind, the audience only reinforced his authority. He straightened his suit jacket and took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Darius until only a few feet separated them. I hope you understand, Gregory said with a thin smile, that pretending to have connections is not going to change the situation. Darius glanced briefly at the phone again. Angela was still listening. Then he spoke into the receiver, his voice steady and clear. Angela, please confirm something for me. Who currently manages the Whitman Grand property? There was a short pause on the line as Angela accessed the internal system. Her keyboard clicks could faintly be heard through the speaker. The registered general manager is Gregory Whitman, she replied after a moment. He has been in that position for a little over 4 years. Darius nodded slowly. Gregory's confident expression remained unchanged, though the nearby guests were now watching even more closely. Emily Carter felt a sudden tightening in her chest as she listened. Something about the way the conversation was unfolding felt completely different from the misunderstanding Gregory believed he was handling. Darius spoke again into the phone. Thank you. Now, Angela, please open the service compliance file for that property. Gregory let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if he were watching a poorly rehearsed performance. This is ridiculous, he said loudly. You think calling someone on speaker makes this believable? Darius did not respond to the remark. Instead, he looked calmly across the lobby once more, his eyes pausing briefly on the guests who had gathered and then on the young receptionist who had tried to speak earlier. Emily met his gaze for a split second and felt a strange sense that he was not asking for help. He was simply acknowledging that someone in the room had noticed the truth. Angela's voice returned through the phone a moment later. The compliance file is open, she said. Is there an incident that needs to be logged? Darius finally turned his full attention back to Gregory Whitman. The manager's confidence still filled the space between them, but the room itself had begun to feel different, as if the balance of the situation was slowly shifting in ways Gregory could not yet see. Darius spoke clearly enough that several guests nearby could hear every word. Yes, he said calmly into the phone. There is an incident. The acting manager of the Whitman Grand has contacted security to remove a guest without verifying identity or reservation. Gregory's smile faded slightly, though his posture remained firm. Because that guest does not belong here, he interrupted sharply. Darius tilted his head slightly, studying him with quiet patience before continuing his sentence into the phone. And I would like that interaction officially recorded. Angela paused again on the other end of the call. When she spoke, her voice carried a subtle change, the tone of someone who had just realized exactly who the guest in question might be. Understood, she replied carefully. The incident log has been started. Darius lowered the phone from his ear and held it loosely at his side. For a moment he said nothing. The lobby air felt thicker now, heavy with anticipation. Gregory Whitman folded his arms again, determined to maintain control. You can keep pretending, he said coldly. But when security arrives, this performance ends. Darius looked directly at him, the calm in his eyes deeper than before. Then he spoke quietly, not into the phone this time, but directly to the man standing in front of him. That depends, he said evenly, on what happens when the rest of the company hears this recording. For a moment after Darius spoke, the lobby held a strange kind of silence, the kind that happens when a room full of strangers realizes something important is unfolding in front of them. Gregory Whitman's expression tightened, but he quickly forced a confident smile as if nothing had changed. In his mind the situation was still simple. Security would arrive, remove the man standing in front of him, and the morning would continue like any other day at the Whitman Grand. Gregory had handled dozens of difficult guests during his career, and every time the outcome had been the same. Authority always won. He glanced toward the hallway that led to the security office, clearly expecting the uniformed staff to appear at any moment. You are wasting everyone's time, Gregory said sharply, raising his voice just enough so the surrounding guests could hear him. This property has standards, and people who do not meet them are asked to leave. The words drifted across the marble lobby and settled heavily among the silent witnesses. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Emily Carter felt her stomach tighten again. She had heard managers speak firmly to disruptive visitors before, but something about Gregory's tone today felt different. It sounded less like policy and more like assumption. Darius Coleman did not respond immediately. Instead, he slipped the phone back to his ear. Angela Brooks was still connected on the line, quietly monitoring the conversation from hundreds of miles away inside the corporate headquarters of Coleman Hospitality Group. Angela, Darius said calmly, please confirm that the incident log is active. Angela answered without hesitation. Yes, it is active and time-stamped. Everything from the moment you began the call is being documented. Darius nodded slightly. Gregory folded his arms again and let out a small laugh that carried more frustration than confidence now. You keep talking like you are reporting to someone important, he said. But this is my hotel. A few guests shifted their weight at that statement. The woman with the phone in the leather chair slowly leaned forward, making sure her camera captured every word. The businessman near the column raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Emily glanced again at the reservation screen in front of her, then back at the man standing calmly in the hoodie. Something about the way he carried himself did not match Gregory's accusations. It was not arrogance. It was not fear either. It was patience. Darius lowered the phone once more and looked directly at Gregory Whitman. His voice remained calm, but carried a weight that had been slowly building since the moment he walked through the hotel doors. Your hotel, he repeated thoughtfully. Gregory nodded without hesitation. Yes, he replied. The Whitman Grand. And I decide who stays here. The statement echoed through the room. Darius studied him quietly for a second longer before speaking again into the phone. Angela, he said evenly, please pull the ownership records for the Whitman Grand property. There was a brief pause as Angela accessed another section of the company system. The soft sound of typing came through the receiver. Several seconds passed, stretching the silence in the lobby until it felt almost deliberate. Then Angela spoke again. The Whitman Grand is owned by Coleman Hospitality Group, she said clearly. Gregory rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. Anyone could look that up online, he muttered under his breath. But Angela had not finished speaking. Her voice carried a quiet professionalism that suddenly drew the attention of several people standing nearby. And according to the current executive registry, she continued carefully, the majority owner of Coleman Hospitality Group is Darius Coleman. For the first time since the confrontation began, the lobby air shifted completely. The businessman near the column straightened slightly. Emily Carter looked from the phone in Darius's hand to the man himself, as if the pieces of a puzzle had just fallen into place. Gregory Whitman frowned, confusion beginning to replace his earlier confidence. But Darius Coleman simply looked at him calmly and said in the same steady voice he had used since the beginning, "So you see, the situation is a little more complicated than you thought." The words from Angela Brooks still hung in the air like a quiet echo that nobody in the lobby could ignore. Majority owner of Coleman Hospitality Group is Darius Coleman. For several seconds no one moved. The polished marble floor reflected the tall windows along the entrance while morning sunlight stretched across the room. But the calm luxury of the Whitman Grand now felt different. It felt like a stage where the story had suddenly changed direction. Gregory Whitman blinked once as if he had simply misheard the sentence. Then he let out a short, dismissive laugh. "That is not funny," he said sharply, though the humor had already drained from his voice. He looked around at the small crowd of guests who had gathered and forced another confident smile. People try tricks like this all the time. Darius Coleman did not react to the comment. He stood exactly where he had been since the confrontation began, relaxed and steady, the phone still resting loosely in his hand. On the other end of the line, Angela Brooks remained silent, allowing the room to absorb what she had just confirmed. Emily Carter felt her pulse quicken as she looked at the man standing in front of the desk. She had heard the name before. Everyone in the hospitality industry had. Coleman Hospitality Group owned more than 100 luxury hotels across the country, from Miami to Seattle, from Chicago to San Diego. The company's founder appeared occasionally in business magazines and leadership conferences, though his photos were usually taken in boardrooms, not hotel lobbies. Emily slowly looked back at Darius Coleman's face and realized something that made her stomach tighten. The calm voice, the quiet confidence, the patience. The pieces were suddenly aligning in a way Gregory had clearly not considered. Gregory, however, was not ready to accept it. He straightened his jacket and crossed his arms again, trying to recover the authority he believed still belonged to him. "You expect me to believe that you are the owner of this entire company," he said, his voice rising slightly as he spoke. "Walking around in a hoodie and sneakers?" A few guests shifted uncomfortably at the remark. The businessman near the column lowered his coffee cup slowly. The woman with the phone kept recording, her expression sharpening with curiosity. Darius Coleman finally took a slow breath and glanced briefly around the room. The tension, the attention, the quiet disbelief. He had seen this moment before. Not in this building, but in others like it. 25 years earlier, he had stood in a different hotel lobby in Atlanta after a long overnight bus ride from North Carolina. He had been 20 years old, carrying a single duffel bag and a folder filled with scholarship paperwork. The front desk clerk had looked him up and down and told him the same thing Gregory Whitman had implied just minutes earlier. "Guests like you do not belong here." That memory had stayed with him long after the embarrassment faded. It had followed him through every business deal, every investment meeting, every property he purchased. It had become the quiet engine behind Coleman Hospitality Group. And now he was standing inside one of those properties again, listening to the same assumptions echo through a different lobby. Darius looked directly at Gregory Whitman, his expression calm, but unmistakably firm now. Then he lifted the phone slightly and spoke again so Angela could hear. "Angela," he said evenly, "please confirm the corporate headquarters location." Angela responded immediately. "Coleman Hospitality headquarters is located in Chicago, Illinois," she said. Darius nodded once. Then he returned his gaze to Gregory Whitman and spoke with the same calm authority he had carried since the moment he walked through the doors. "That office," he said quietly, "is where my name is on the door." Gregory Whitman stared at Darius Coleman as if the sentence he had just heard could not possibly belong in the same room as him. The manager's confidence, which had filled the lobby only minutes earlier, now flickered like a light struggling against a sudden storm. For the first time since the confrontation began, Gregory did not speak immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything said before. Around them the lobby had transformed completely. The guests who had originally been curious observers were now standing still, watching with open interest. The businessman near the column slowly set his coffee cup down on a nearby table, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Darius more carefully. The woman recording with her phone adjusted her grip so the camera focused clearly on both men. Even the bellhop near the entrance stood perfectly still, no longer pretending to organize brochures. Emily Carter felt her heart beating faster as she looked at Gregory, waiting to see how he would respond. She had never seen the manager hesitate before. Gregory finally cleared his throat and forced out a short laugh that sounded thinner than before. "You expect me to believe that," he said, gesturing loosely toward Darius. "You run an entire hospitality company?" His voice carried a sharp edge, but the certainty behind it had started to crack. Darius Coleman did not react to the tone. Instead, he slipped his phone back to his ear for a moment. Angela Brooks was still listening quietly on the line. "Angela," Darius said calmly, "please notify corporate compliance that we have an active service incident at the Whitman Grand." Angela answered immediately, her voice composed and professional. "Understood. The compliance team will receive the report within the next few minutes." Darius nodded once before lowering the phone again. Gregory shook his head as if dismissing the entire exchange. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "You think making phone calls changes reality?" The guests nearby exchanged glances. Emily looked down briefly at the front desk computer and then back up again. Something in her instincts told her that reality had already begun changing, even if Gregory had not noticed yet. Darius stood quietly for another moment, studying the man in front of him with the calm patience of someone who had spent years learning when to speak and when to simply let time reveal the truth. The distant sound of the hotel's glass entrance doors sliding open drifted through the lobby. Two security officers stepped inside, responding to the earlier call Gregory had made. Their uniforms were neat, their posture professional as they approached the front desk area. Gregory immediately straightened, relief flashing across his face as if reinforcements had finally arrived. "Perfect timing," he said quickly, gesturing toward Darius. "This gentleman has been refusing to leave the property." The two officers slowed as they approached, glancing between Gregory and the man standing calmly in the hoodie. One of them, a tall guard with a calm expression, looked directly at Darius Coleman. Something about the situation made him pause before speaking. Darius met his gaze with the same steady calm he had carried since the beginning. Then he spoke quietly, not with anger, but with simple clarity. "Before you escort anyone anywhere," he said evenly, "you may want to confirm who actually owns this building." The security officers exchanged a brief look. Gregory opened his mouth to interrupt, but at that exact moment the phone in his jacket pocket began to ring. The sound cut through the quiet lobby like a sudden alarm. Gregory frowned, pulling the phone out quickly and glancing at the screen. His expression changed almost instantly. The caller identification displayed a number he recognized immediately. Corporate headquarters. For a moment, Gregory Whitman simply stared at the phone as it continued ringing in his hand, the weight of the situation finally beginning to settle around him. Gregory Whitman stared at the phone vibrating in his hand as if it had suddenly become heavier than it should be. The bright screen illuminated his face, while the caller identification continued flashing the same words over and over again. Corporate headquarters. The quiet lobby seemed to hold its breath. A few guests leaned forward slightly, sensing that the moment they had been watching unfold was about to shift again. Gregory swallowed and quickly pressed the answer button, raising the phone to his ear while trying to maintain the confident posture he had carried earlier. "Gregory Whitman speaking," he said, his voice carefully controlled. On the other end of the line, a calm but unmistakably serious voice responded. "Mr. Whitman, this is Daniel Harris from Corporate Compliance." Gregory's eyes flicked briefly toward Darius Coleman and then back down to the marble floor as he listened. "Yes," Gregory replied quickly. "I was just handling a situation with an individual who was refusing to leave the property." There was a pause from the other end of the call, the kind that made the surrounding silence feel even louder. Several guests were now watching openly. Emily Carter stood perfectly still behind the front desk, her hands resting lightly on the keyboard as she tried to hear the conversation without appearing to listen. The security officers remained near the entrance, their attention shifting between Gregory and the calm man standing only a few feet away. Then Daniel Harris spoke again through the phone, his voice measured and direct. "Mr. Whitman, we are aware of the situation. That is why I am calling." Gregory frowned slightly, confusion beginning to replace the certainty he had carried earlier. "You are aware?" he repeated. "Yes," Daniel replied. "And I suggest you listen very carefully to what I am about to say." The guests in the lobby could not hear the voice on the other end, but they could see Gregory's expression slowly changing as the conversation continued. His shoulders stiffened. His confident smile disappeared completely. "Sir," Gregory said after a moment, lowering his voice, "there must be some misunderstanding." Across from him, Darius Coleman remained still, watching quietly with the same calm patience that had defined his presence since the beginning. The security officers glanced toward him again. One of them seemed to recognize something now, though he did not speak. Daniel Harris continued speaking through the phone. "Mr. Whitman," he said clearly, "the individual standing in your lobby is not trespassing. He is not a problem guest. He is the majority owner of Coleman Hospitality Group." Gregory's face went pale for a split second before he quickly turned away from the crowd, as if trying to shield his reaction. "I did not know," he whispered into the phone. Daniel Harris responded without hesitation. "That is exactly the issue." A long pause followed. Gregory looked back toward Darius slowly, his expression no longer confident but uncertain. The room seemed to feel the shift instantly. The guests who had gathered exchanged quiet looks. Emily Carter felt a strange mix of relief and tension ripple through her chest. Daniel Harris spoke again through the phone, his voice firm and professional. "Mr. Whitman, the incident you initiated has already been documented by our compliance team. The call you made to security, the statements you made to the guest, and the failure to verify identity before escalating the situation have all been recorded." Gregory closed his eyes briefly, the realization beginning to settle over him like a heavy shadow. Meanwhile, Darius Coleman stood quietly, his expression neither angry nor triumphant. If anything, he looked disappointed. The lobby lights reflected softly across the marble floor as the silence deepened. Finally, Gregory spoke again into the phone, his voice now noticeably lower than before. "What happens now?" he asked. The answer from Daniel Harris came without hesitation. "Now," he said, "we correct the situation immediately." The silence in the lobby stretched for several seconds after Daniel Harris's final words echoed through Gregory Whitman's phone. "Now we correct the situation immediately." Gregory slowly lowered the phone from his ear, his hand no longer steady the way it had been earlier. The confidence that had filled his voice just minutes ago had completely vanished. Around him, the quiet luxury of the Whitman Grand remained the same: polished marble, the tall glass windows, the warm light from the chandelier above, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The guests who had gathered were no longer pretending to be casual observers. They were watching openly now, understanding that they had just witnessed something far more serious than a simple misunderstanding at the front desk. Emily Carter looked between Gregory and Darius Coleman, her mind racing as the reality of the moment settled in. The man standing calmly in the hoodie was not a confused traveler. He was the owner of the entire company that operated the hotel. Gregory finally turned to face Darius again, but the authority he had carried earlier was gone. In its place was a strained uncertainty that everyone in the room could see. The two security officers stood quietly a few feet away, their posture respectful now as they understood the change in the situation. For a moment, Gregory opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Darius Coleman watched him calmly, his expression steady and composed. He had not raised his voice once since entering the building. He had not argued or demanded special treatment. He had simply allowed the truth to arrive at its own pace. Gregory glanced down at the phone in his hand again, as if hoping the call had not actually happened. But the screen had already gone dark. The message from corporate compliance was clear. Emily Carter finally broke the silence, her voice careful but sincere. "Sir," she said quietly to Darius, "would you like us to prepare a suite for you?" Several guests nearby shifted slightly, their curiosity turning into quiet respect as the situation became fully understood. Darius looked at her and gave a small nod of appreciation before answering. "Thank you," he said calmly, "but that will not be necessary today." He then turned his attention back to Gregory Whitman. The manager looked smaller now than he had earlier, as if the weight of the moment had slowly pressed down on his shoulders. Darius studied him for a second, not with anger, but with something closer to disappointment. "You know," Darius said quietly, his voice steady enough that the nearby guests could hear every word. When someone walks into a hotel, the first question should never be whether they belong there. Gregory lowered his eyes slightly, unable to meet the calm gaze in front of him. The security officers remained still. The guests listened in silence. Darius continued, his tone thoughtful rather than harsh. The real question is whether the people running the building understand what hospitality actually means. The words settled across the lobby with a quiet finality. Darius then slipped his phone back into his pocket and took a slow look around the room one last time. The employees behind the desk, the guests who had witnessed everything, the security officers near the entrance. Then he turned toward the glass doors that led out to the street. Before leaving, he paused briefly and spoke one last sentence without raising his voice. "Respect is not something you measure by appearance," he said calmly. "It is something you practice the moment a guest walks through the door." With that, he stepped toward the exit, leaving behind a lobby that would remember that lesson long after the morning crowd had disappeared.